It's a great honor and pleasure to address the members of the International Council of Museums. Unfortunately, I'm not in Milano, but in Istanbul, in Museum of Innocence. Museum of Innocence is both a novel that I wrote and published in 2008 in Istanbul, and a museum I opened 4 years later in 2012, again in Istanbul. It's not that I published successfully a novel and wanted to make a museum of it. No, I conceived the museum and the novel together. The novel is a love story. The museum exhibits all the objects that the characters in the novel touch, are related to, or the landscapes, photos, films of Istanbul that they see. The novel takes place in Istanbul and the museum is in Istanbul. I wrote the novel collecting all the objects my fictional characters would use in the story. So the novel and the museum both touch the same story. The museum is an interpretation of a fictional story. Between the ages of 7 and 22, as I chronicled in my autobiography, Istanbul, I wanted to be a painter. I failed in that in a strange way, and I began writing novels. 15 years later, when I successfully managed to be a Turkish novelist, I decided to go back to art again. That's why perhaps I did this museum. At the beginning, I thought that I would open the museum the day I published the novel, thus the novel acting as a sort of annotated museum catalog, where the annotations are manipulated in such a way that it reads like a novel or an experimental novel or a postmodernist novel. Later, I thought that I would make the novel read like a normal novel and publish a museum catalog, which is Innocence of Memories, that I published. One reason that I opened the museum 4 years later than publishing the novel is that it took a lot of time forming, composing, discussing the vitrines, boxes, windows in the museum. The logic of the museum follows the logic of the novel. The novel has 83 chapters. In the end, when the museum is finished, I thought to have 83 boxes representing the novel. The objects in the museums are the things that the characters in the novel touch, see, or look at. So, in a way, this is also a small, modest city museum of Istanbul, covering the last 50 years of 20th century. Unfortunately, Istanbul doesn't have a city museum up to now. As I was busy with finishing the museum, worrying about the beauty of the vitrines and boxes, giving increasingly more time to the making, composition, and beauty of the museums, I begin to think more and more about the meaning of the museums. Why would people come to the museum? What people are actually doing in the museums? And I begin to gather more thoughts, critical thoughts about the importance of the place of museums as institutions in our lives, and develop some thoughts that I expressed and published in Innocence of Objects, the catalog for the Museum of Innocence, a real catalog. Here is some quotes from my Manifesto for small museums. I love museums, and I'm not alone in finding that they make me happier with each passing day. I take museums very seriously, and that sometimes leads me to angry, forceful thoughts, which I'm going to express now. I do not have in me to speak about museums with anger. In my childhood, there were very few museums in Istanbul. Most of these were historical monuments, or quite rare outside the Western world. They were places with an air of government offices about them. Later, the small museums in back streets of European cities led me to realize that museums, just like novels, can also speak for individuals. That is not to understate the importance of the Louvre, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Topkapi Palace, the British Museum, the Prado, the Vatican Museums, all veritable treasures of humankind. But I'm against these precious monumental institutions being used as blueprints for future museums. Museums should explore and uncover the universe and humanity of the new and modern men emerging from increasingly wealthy non-Western nations. I especially wrote this manifesto addressing Asian museums that are going up and developing. The aim of the big state-sponsored museums, on the other hand, is to represent the state. This is neither a good nor an innocent objective. Here are my propositions for new museums. Here are some subjects that we have to think about increasingly. Large national museums such as the Louvre and the Hermitage took shape and turned into essential tourist destinations alongside the opening of royal and imperial palaces to the public. These institutions, now national symbols, present the story of the nation, history in a word, as being far more important than the stories of individuals. This is unfortunate because the stories of individuals are much better suited to displaying the depths of our humanity. The second proposition I want to make, we can see that transitions from palaces to national museums and from epics to novels are parallel processes. Epics are like palaces and speak of the heroic exploits of the old kings who lived in them. National museums then should be like novels, but they are not. 3. We don't need more museums that try to construct the historical narratives of society, community, team, nation, state, tribe, company, or species. We all know that the ordinary, everyday stories of individuals are richer, more humane, and much more joyful. 4. Demonstrating the wealth of Chinese, Indian, Mexican, Iranian, or Turkish history and culture is not an issue. It must be done, of course, but it's not difficult to do. The real challenge is to use museums to tell with the same brilliance, depth, and power the stories of the individual human beings living in these countries. 5. The measure of a museum's success should not be its ability to represent a state, a nation, or a company, or a particular history. It should be its capacity to reveal the humanity of individuals. We should judge museums by this criteria. 6. It is imperative that museums become smaller, more individualistic, and cheaper. This is the only way that they will ever tell stories on human scale. Big museums with their wide doors call upon us to forget our humanity and embrace the state and its human masses. This is why millions outside the Western world are afraid of going to museums because they remind them of the government. 7. The aim of present and future museums must not be to represent the state, but to recreate the world of single human beings, the same human beings who have labored under ruthless oppression for hundreds of years. 8. The resources that are channeled into monumental, symbolic museums should be diverted to small museums that tell the stories of individuals. These resources should also be used to encourage and support people in turning their own small homes and stories into exhibition places. 9. If objects are not uprooted from their environs and their streets, but are situated with care and ingenuity in their natural homes, they will already portray their own stories. Instead, we need modest museums that honor the neighborhoods and streets and the homes and shops nearby and turn them into elements of their exhibitions. In short, the future of museums is inside our homes. In fact, the picture is very, very simple. We used to have epics. We need novels. We used to have representation in the museums. We need expression. We used to have monuments. We need homes. We had histories in the museum. We need stories in the museums. We had nations in the museums. We need persons. We had groups and teams in the museums. We need individuals in the museums. We had large and expensive museums, and we continue to have more large and expensive museums, especially in Asia, where the government money is going increasingly to big museums, while we need small and cheap museums to address our humanity. My Museum of Innocence in Istanbul opened 4 years ago, perhaps with these ideas. At the beginning, I didn't have these ideas actually. I just wanted to make a museum. It was a wild idea, but I followed my instinct and found myself in all the troubles that museum people have. And with my anger, with my style, I expressed myself. I'm happy that I did so. I think that increasingly and strongly, museum people should also express their strong ideas, just like a novelist, just like an artist, just like other curators, saying that this is what I think, this is my taste, this is my individuality, and get closer to persons, wherever they are, rather than the nation, the state, the government. We have opened the Museum of Innocence in Istanbul 4 years after publishing the novel. In the last 4 years, we had 150,000 visitors. We are very happy. Like many museums, 60-65% of our visitors are international. We are very happy by the fact that our ticket money covers all our expenses. But unfortunately, in the last 6 months, bombs are exploding in Istanbul, and our numbers, along with the numbers of other museums in Istanbul, went down. We are in touch with the community of museum managers, curators, museum owners in Istanbul, and we have seen that their numbers also went down. But in Museum of Innocence, the problem, because even the dropped number of visitors covers our money, our budget, we are not as unhappy as the other state-sponsored, big company-sponsored museums. Perhaps one reason is that our ticket money covers all the expenses of the people who are working in Museum of Innocence, and perhaps another reason, I strongly think so, that people who are working in Museum of Innocence also own the museum, are parts of the museum, believe in the idea of the museum. We are representing the humanity of the people in our neighborhood. We did this museum in a way in picking up objects from the life of the people that live around us. Museum of Innocence and the political, economical crisis that Turkey is now experiencing showed us that small museums are more flexible to economical, political, social crisis. I wish to the members of International Council of Museums a fruitful discussion. This is a time to discuss the individuality of people who come to museums, of people who make museums, of people who are wondering why they are in the museums and increasingly come to the museums. We all love museums. That's why we think it's very important and urgent, in fact, that we have to think more about what's happening in the museums, what's the logic of museums, and what is the future of museums. I again repeat, the future of the museum should be based more on the individuality of persons.